Our final panelist is Dr. Praba Manuratne.
Thank you, Soumya. Good evening, distinguished guests, Dr. Madhubhashini Disanayake Ratnayake, and friends, colleagues, the authors present here today who humble us. අපේ කුදු බව අපට පසක් කරන මෙහි සිටින සියලු ජ්‍යෙෂ්ඨ සිංහල ලේඛකයන්ගෙන් විශේෂයෙන් අවසරයි. I quote from just one line from Kumari Kumaragamage's short story, "Come and tell your story out loud and discover a new one." Just one line. "When I tell this and tell this and tell this, I can be free and start a new story." Reading this line from Madhubhashini Disanayake Ratnayake's translation of Kumari Kumaragamage's short story, I was reminded of a poem by the Sri Lankan Jewish writer Anne Ranasinghe that the many connoisseurs of Sri Lankan poetry in English present here are familiar with. At a German art exhibition held in Colombo, a Sri Lankan comments about the Germans' obsession with the Holocaust, and I quote from the poem, "And then you demand, when will the Germans stop saying mea culpa? Never, I hope. For under their mea culpa lie buried millions of dead. And would you, for the sake of your comfort, that we forget?" End quote. Madhubhashini Disanayake Ratnayake's Routledge Companion to Sinhala Fiction from Post-War Sri Lanka, Resistance and Reconfiguration provides us with an opportunity to reflect on what the conscience of the Sinhalese would mean after this war. I see you shake your heads. Yes, no, there is no such thing as a Sinhalese conscience, at least not one. That is too gross a generalization. Nevertheless, let us not stop saying mea culpa, for it must be told over and over and over again, as the character from the short story I quoted earlier said, if we are to imagine the possibility of a new story. Now, very briefly, some of the other speakers touched on the larger sociopolitical landscape and the publishing industry and the political significance of this translation. So, in this short presentation, it's just 10 minutes, and honestly, it just cannot do justice to the work that has gone into this work in 10 minutes. That is a bit unfair, but I want to do something slightly more humble than talk on like a more global term. I just want to look at the actual translation. I can't do a lot, but maybe take like a few instances and look at some of the challenges that translators face when they try to translate from Sinhala into English. For most readers and critics of translation, the value of a translation lies in its fidelity to the original text. This is what we look for, right? How faithful is this text to the original? The language of literary translation theory would call this the equivalence, the level of equivalence. But notions of equivalence remain complicated by the fact that no literary translation can produce an absolute equivalence to the original text or the source text in a language and grammar that is structurally different from that of the target text. When translating literature, thus, what becomes central is not only the fidelity to the original at the level of meaning, but also the translation's ability to produce a reading that can convey the contextual and aesthetic context as well as the ethos of the original text. So this is really challenging, I think. Thus, literary translations demand not simply rendering meanings in a different language, but the translation of that particular context, of that particular novel or short story or writing. Just let me give one small example from the text. This is from Kaushalya Kumarasinghe's book that is translated here. I'm just reading a very short excerpt, and he hasn't been discussed before, so I think that's okay. Quote, "I am more thirsty than hungry. Here, that ayah who went in the vehicle just now seems a very nice man. He is the only one in a vehicle who stopped and took a leaflet. He even said thanks, Nangi, to me. But his eyes looked sad, The girl next to him looked like a loose woman though. Wait, I will tell that bugger when he goes back to meet you if he wants a character certificate or something. Ane, don't call him that bugger. That ayah is very good. Really? I will tell that person that, okay? Talk of the devil. He will never die. There. Your prince in the real world has come, she said, pointing at a Hero Honda cycle that had come and parked near them just now. Don't shout, woman. There is only friendship between us. This is like a quotation from the text. Is it okay if I read it in Sinhala? I'll read it really quickly. මටනම් තිබ්බහයි. මේ අර ඉස්සලගේ වාහනේ අයියා හරි හොඳ පාටයිනේ. ඒ අය විතරයි වාහනේ නවත්තලා කොලයක් ගත්තේ. මට තෑන්ක්ස් නංගි කියලාත් කිව්වා. ඒත් ඒ අයගේ ඇස් හරි දුක පාටයි යන්නේ. ඒ වුණාට අර ඒ අයගේ එහා පැත්තේ හිටපු කෙල්ල නම් හරි වල් වගේ. හිටපන් ඌ ආපහු යනකොට මං කියන්න ඌට චරිතසහතිකයක් එහෙම ඕනොත් උඹව හම්බ වෙන්න කියලා. අනේ ඌ කියන්න එපා ඒ අයියා හරි හොඳයි. ඇත්තද? මං අරයට කියනවා ඕන්න. අම්මද බොල. මූණම් මැරෙන්නේ නැහැ. උඹ ඇත්ත ලෝකේ කුමාරයා ඇවිත්. මේ දැන් පැමිණ උන්ට මදක් දුරින් නැවතු හීරෝ හොන්ඩා මෝටර් සයිකල් දෙසට අත තික් කරමින් පවසයි. කෑ ගහන්න එපා බං අපි අතරේ තියෙන්නේ සහෝදරකමක් විතරයි. Now this seems like a really, in quote, this seems like a really sort of simple conversation that can be translated very directly. But Madhu, I think you have immense courage to take on this work, because I'm just reading through this work, I was thinking of the many choices that you would have had to make. I wouldn't have slept on some of these, couldn't have slept on some of these. Now the translator faces several difficulties. First, translating the context. In the previous paragraph just before this, we have learned the following. So now this is again a quote. Now who was walking towards her was a thin girl wearing a long skirt and a long-sleeved blouse. Her hands held a till. It had been made by covering a tin with white paper. It had printed on it the words, "Let's protect free education." Only those, end quote, only those familiar with the Sri Lankan state university system and student activism within it will understand the context of the scene described, and the translator very unhelpfully does not give any of this context. That is, those who know will know. The translator, however, must either give enough contextual evidence for the reader to understand what is going on, or simply leave it to the reader to pick up whatever they can. And the latter is the choice that the translator has made. But now, so that is one thing. How much of context can you give in a translation? How many footnotes? You know, the temptation to put footnotes when you're a translator is just amazing, but it's also very distracting, right? It's a very academic thing to do, and you have completely not given into that. But now we have the added challenge of translating the heavily diglossic Sinhala into a more standardized variety of English, what could safely be called by today's standards, and I'm no expert in this, standard Sri Lankan English. So how does the translator render the rich variety of the second person pronouns, the third person pronouns, etc. in the Sinhala, as well as the layered cultural meanings behind this seemingly simple conversation? The only two words that the translator provides any explanation to are the direct borrowings, Aya and Nangi. That's all that gets footnoted. But consider the usage of the three words, bugger to mean oo, that person to mean araya, and friendship to mean sahodarakama. Now, before we jump to judge the translator for not being literal in the translation, let us consider why these choices must be made. First, bugger, which is a rather informal or in some contexts derogatory term to mean man, and with very specific sexual connotations, is used for the oo in Sinhala, which also generally, at least in polite society, is used when addressing someone inferior. Yet among university students, this language is not uncommon, and to call someone oo may not be insulting enough. The problem, of course, is that in English, there aren't enough synonyms for the pronoun he to bring out the simple derogation suggested by the speaker in the text. This is the problem. Lad, chap, bloke, guy, fellow. None of these words can do justice to oo. But none of them sound insulting enough for the young woman to react to her friend with a don't call him Muane, right? That kind of, this is the challenge of the translator. And she uses the sexually loaded term, bugger, to get something. Of course, one must give something, giving it a certain sexual twist that does not appear in the original. So it's a choice that then you have to make. The suggestion that the young woman is attracted to the man must also be highlighted, so that it forms as a foil to the entrance of her lover, Araya, or that person. The term Araya is beset with similar complications. It is a word associated either with ruralness or with the older generation, where a woman would not address her husband directly by name, but would call him Araya. Not only does it signify certain rural qualities in the speech of the two girls, but it also betrays their social and or class origins. When rendered as that person, with no explanation in English, this entire background may be lost to the translator. But the translator is able to compensate this unfamiliar usage with something more familiar to the English reader. Talk of the devil, he will never die. In the Sinhala, Ammada Bola is a highly colloquial term to mean a surprised awe. And Moonam Marinene is a reference to the common belief that someone who appears when talked about will have a long life, right? So these are all various little cultural clues that can't be translated, because if you try to include it, then the suggestive nature of the original text disappears. So this is the problem. And then the third term is there is only friendship between us. Now, if you know anything about Sri Lankan Sinhalese speaking lovers, and if you suggest that we are only friends, right? But in the given political context, it's not even friendship, it's a sahodarakama. Now, this word sahodara, as we know, is just ridiculously difficult to translate into English, right? So then the translator, because if you say what we have is a brotherhood, it doesn't make sense, right? You just can't. So then what are the choices? These are the difficulties, and this is why I think it's an immense challenge that a translator takes on. And all translators take on this challenge, but I just wanted to show, a little bit of the book and just tell you what it's like. Now, I read this one paragraph in great detail to make several points about this translation. First, I want to make the point that versatile translators constantly challenge the purist idea that the target text should render the original in full equivalence, right? To say this translation is wrong is just not going to be an adequate way of thinking about it, right? If the translator was sloppy, I would not be this generous, right? If I felt like the translator had just skipped over the difficult parts, then that's a different thing. But here, she's not dropping, she's trying to find alternatives. And each alternative has a political context that goes beyond the mere act of, saying one word in another language, finding an equivalent in another language. And yet, and then there's another problem, even if you manage to somehow get that context across, such semantic translations also have their limits. It would nearly be impossible to translate a oo into English as a pronoun. It must be replaced with a noun, right? So all of these complexities that then also work into the problem of what kind of English do we accept as acceptable, formal enough English for a translation. This is the other thing. How much can you borrow? For example, I was thinking, okay, if I had translated, what would I have put? For example, imagine if the translator had put, quote, Ammada Bola, this guy is not going to die soon. There your real world prince has come, right? But then, the fairly conservative literary establishment would say, if you can't translate Ammada Bola, then are you a real translator? right? This dilemma of how to capture the richness and the layeredness of the language and still also deal with the complexity of having to work with a very different language. English doesn't have the sort of the colloquial diglossic nature that Sinhala has. It's a different kind of language, right? So just one more thing. Here is another very challenging part from Nisanka Wijayamana's Handa Paluwa Tanitharu. Again, a very difficult text, I think, to translate. This amicable bully was the only one I had in place of both my mother and my father. I am not sure if that phrase is suitable. The loving enemy. Do you know, he even gave me money. 5 of the 100 rupee notes. Do you think I took it? The way the teacher was telling it, Anil thought that he would not have accepted it. No, I took it. There was no way I could not have, the way he offered it to me. The loving persuasion. Yes, I took the money, end quote. When translating such difficult and multi-layered texts in Sinhala into the rather monoglossic standard Sri Lankan English, the translator must not simply translate the text and its context. And the third challenge is also to translate its very ethos and emotion, right? I think that's what you were also hinting at earlier. You know, how do we get that? The love of one man, a Sinhalese, towards the other, a Muslim, laced with enmity between father, father-in-law, and son, and the denial of love, right? So it's a sort of a love-hate relationship between a Muslim father-in-law, potentially, and a son-in-law, right? So it's a very complicated kind of ethos to convey, even in, I think, in Sinhala, and then to have to translate it into English and still retain at least some level of that feeling, I think, is the challenge. And therein lies the craft of the work of translation. And I would even say, I think it is the art of translation. I think that's where translation becomes an art. Now, I know the politics of this book lie broadly in its claim to post-war Sinhala fiction. As we know, translating literature in vernacular languages into English is tied to the by now notorious Orientalist project, one that continues in its many forms, from publishing native texts in English that Professor Sasanka was talking about earlier, to the complex politics of the Booker Prize, for example, in the modern, postmodern publishing industry. It's a very complicated history. Madhubhashini is careful to frame her project in a different light. She says in her introduction, in no uncertain terms, that her purpose is to translate for those in Sri Lanka, those who cannot read Sinhala, presumably those who read in Tamil. And she did say that she started this off as her doctoral work. So I don't know if you plan to have it published by Routledge, but I mean, you know, books have their own life. But I think her claim is really important, and I think we need to take it seriously and think about that. Her selection bears witness to her capacity to pick works that are complex literary works. I mean, I would agree with Professor Liyanage Amarakirti there. I think as literary works, these are very complex works, as well as highly political literary texts that showcase not only the thematic variety and richness of Sinhala writing, but also its anti-hegemonic thrust, particularly among the progressive writers. It's a small number of people, but it's an important presence in Sinhala literature. Here, I must commend her for her excellent choice of text and its representation of the variety and diversity of Sri Lankan literature, fiction in Sinhala. There are themes and representations that have been left out, but let us focus on what is in rather than what is not there. And the book does offer us much. Read, for example, The Deer Slayer Solomon. It's a multi-layered text. I mean, I'm afraid to even quote the names because each one is just these are very powerful texts, the way I read them. Or Prabhat Jayasinghe's some scenes from an off-track train that he read earlier. And I don't want to give spoiler alerts, but you should read that. It's an amazing kind of rendering of what is happening to us in our society. Where a fruit seller's soul begs rebirth so he's begging to be reborn to an academic woman that he had saved by sacrificing his life. What does that even mean? Right, and then in the process you have a train caught in a tsunami. All of this that looks like magical realism with very little magic and far too realistic, if you ask me. I don't want to name each story here. All of them are great in their own way. But reading this excellent translation, in which the slips were few and masterful renderings were many, I want to ask that we consider not only the language politics of Tamil and Sinhala, but also that of English. And I say this because I know that this is work that Madhu herself is already engaged in. What is the kind of English that will become acceptable as literary Sri Lankan English? While linguists, particularly sociolinguists, have made many strides in crafting a more dynamic and versatile approach to Sri Lankan English that is closer to the way the majority of people in this country now use this language, the literary gatekeeping seems a bit more conservative. So especially when it comes to translations, because you're translating from a vernacular language, you want to look like you know the English well, and so there's always this process of power at work when you are doing this kind of work. Thank you, Dr. Disanayake Ratnayake, for this wonderful work. It was truly an honor to have been invited to speak here. I want to end by returning to the political choice that all of us who work in the arts have today, the various choices, but the ones that I mentioned at the beginning. To keep telling this and telling this and telling this, and never to stop saying mea culpa in the face of the grave injustice done to the Tamils and other minorities in this country. What we need is not to get past that history and somehow have this mythical unity, but create other less certain narratives about our ethno-religious identities, being sensitive over and over again to the complex class politics of writing in English and translating into English the works written in this country. Thank you very much and congratulations.
Thank you, Praba.